Time now to get a closer look at how COVID-19 has accelerated digital health technologies on the ground, what it means for the future paradigm of modern drug development, how digital will drive new innovation, and how Massachusetts is in the sweet spot of this acceleration. Your moderator, Craig Lipset, has two excellent guests with two distinct perspectives. Craig is the former longtime chief of clinical innovation at Pfizer, and he's now at Rutgers University. Craig?
Thanks, Mike. My name is Craig Lipset, and it is a pleasure to be here today with the Mass Biotech audience. So today we're going to talk a bit about the impact of COVID on clinical trials and clinical trial continuity during the year 2020. We're going to take that conversation. We're going to talk specifically about how digital has had its moment this year and how has digital become a critical enabler for the continuity of this entire medicine development portfolio, but then carry our conversation a bit further still and start to explore ways that Massachusetts may be uniquely positioned to help catalyze even more of that transformation and change that's happening in drug development, in the pharmaceutical industry, and across the life sciences community. So with that, it's my pleasure to introduce two panelists who are going to join me for this conversation. I would first like to introduce Claire Bonacci, who is a health and life sciences leader at Microsoft. Hello, Claire.
Hey, Craig. My name is Claire Bonacci. I'm the Senior Director for U.S. Health and Life Sciences at Microsoft. I focus on innovating around the big pain points in pharma and life sciences, and my background is predominantly in clinical trial development and trial execution globally.
Thank you, Claire. And I'm also joined by Adam Landman. Adam, hello.
Hi, nice to see you, and thanks for the opportunity to join this discussion. My name is Adam Landman. I'm an emergency physician at Brigham and Women's Hospital in Boston, and I'm also the Chief Information Officer. I oversee day-to-day IT activities in our institution, including keeping our email systems and electronic health record systems running, as well as digital innovation activities. And as you know, a growing number of clinical trials are making use of information technology and digital health tools. So looking forward to today's conversation.
And I will reciprocate with a brief introduction. So for those I haven't met out there, my name is Craig Lipset. I'm an independent advisor today, but I was most recently the head of clinical innovation at Pfizer. Today I serve on the faculty at Rutgers University in health informatics, as well as at the University of Rochester in the Center for Health and Technology, and otherwise spend my time advising pharma and biotech companies on their development strategies, as well as together with a number of tech companies in the space. So I think for this conversation, I'll also add some color as an industry insider and share a bit of perspective there. But let's jump right in. Claire, this has been a tragic year for so many in across our country, across the planet from a global health perspective. But during this time, we also had an entire global medicine development pipeline across therapeutic areas that was active and underway back in March. What were some of the countermeasures that you've seen organizations take to sustain those clinical trials and to keep medicine development happening?
Well, definitely, I think 2020 brought a lot of changes to clinical trials, to clinical research in general. I think one of the biggest changes we saw is that patients in general just totally shifted. Everything shifted virtually, and I think trials and clinical research really had to shift incredibly fast to actually accommodate that. So I saw a lot of changes when it came to switching to virtual trials, trying to do things more remotely, whether that was remote patient monitoring or virtual visits, virtual e-consenting. I think there was kind of just this big shift as patients had to suddenly stay home and were not allowed to come into hospitals to do whatever assessments they needed. So I think the shift was kind of needed almost in the industry, and it just so happens that a global pandemic was the thing to push it in that direction.
That's a great way of looking at it. Claire, I imagine many of these changes were not necessarily new innovations, but were solutions that maybe were out there, but were struggling a bit for adoption before the pandemic.
Exactly. And I think, this is probably a change for the better and a change for the future that we're going to see continue even after the pandemic hopefully subsides.
Adam, as a leader at one of the largest health institutions in the country, the pandemic, I know, must have brought significant change for you to manage across the enterprise. Before we dig into clinical research, what have been some of the primary countermeasures that you've had to introduce this year?
Just building on Claire's comments, because I think what she observed on the research side was very similar on the clinical side. And I similarly look at COVID with a silver lining, that many of us have been focused on trying to roll out and trying to move healthcare virtually for many years. And COVID really provided the impetus and the acceleration to do that. And as background, it was really the reason for this is because we were all trying to stay safe. We wanted to keep our patients safe by ideally keeping them out of our healthcare facilities unless they absolutely had to be there. And the same with our staff. We wanted to keep them remote if possible. And if staff did need to be in our facilities, we wanted to do as much care possibly as remote that we could. And so just to highlight, on the ambulatory side for patient visits to the office, before COVID, we were doing about, across the Mass General Brigham system, we were doing about 75 virtual visits a day. During the peak of COVID, we saw 12,500 virtual visits per day. And that's across our system. And I think if you look at the data from systems across the country, that was a similar increase, a huge increase in virtual visits. On the inpatient side of care, similarly, when we had patients hospitalized that were either suspected COVID positive or COVID positive, we wanted to minimize the contact of staff and others with those patients. And so we also started using virtual technologies on the inpatient side. So we very rapidly deployed tablets across all of our inpatient facilities. So we deployed thousands of tablets and deployed specialized intercom software that allowed our staff to remain outside the room or actually even remote entirely from our facilities and be able to talk with our inpatients. So that further protected our staff and also helped us conserve personal protective equipment. So the gowns, the masks that were in critical short supply during much of the surge. And the third component that we really accelerated was triage tools. And so, as you might imagine, there are a lot of questions with COVID around, should I be seen? Do I need to be tested? And so we quickly stood up call centers to be able to answer questions from patients, from other clinicians and other staff. But those call lines were actually quickly inundated. So many of us, our institution and many around the country, stood up chatbots that enabled patients and providers to interact with an electronic chatbot to determine, to get some information about COVID and to determine how to best triage their patient under their circumstances to the most appropriate care site. So as I said, I think this was a silver lining in that these were tools that many of us have been working on for years, and we saw huge gains in adoption, and I think we saw real value. This was our frontline clinicians were asking us for these tools. They saw how beneficial they were to providing care.
Thank you, Adam. I think there are many leaders inside of development organizations at pharmaceutical companies and biotech companies across the community that probably have had a very similar experience, where many of them have been wanting to make changes in how we monitor our studies, or make changes in how we can shift the location for where patients participate to make our studies more accessible and perhaps enable even more diverse patients to be able to participate. And in many of those cases now that there's been a little bit of adoption a lot of adoption over a short period of time, now there's this hope that there'll be commitment, that these areas will actually stick and persist going forward. Adam, are you sensing that the physicians across your ecosystem and the patients, the many patients that you're engaging with every day, are they expecting this going forward? Is this what they're looking for and how they're accessing care?
Absolutely. I think we are absolutely going to find a new normal. we are not going back to the way it was done, where all care was in person and in-person visits. I think what we're trying to figure out now is what is that new normal, and really trying to be thoughtful about appropriateness of care. So which visits and what care types can you do virtually, and which do you really need to do in person? And I think there is still analysis underway to answer that question, and we need to be careful. There are some cases where you absolutely need to do a physical exam, things that you just simply can't do virtually. And there are other encounters that make a lot of sense to do virtually. And I think this period allowed us to figure that out, since we forced almost all of the care to be done virtually. We now have a better sense of what should be done virtually and what is inappropriate to be done virtually, and we're adjusting to that. And in fact, we're already seeing this in my own institution. We have certainly seen a shift back to in-person care, but we are not seeing virtual care completely plummet. We're seeing a healthy amount of virtual care continue. And there's no doubt that our clinicians like it. Patients definitely like it. They don't want to have to. They don't want to have to make their way into the city, pay for parking, wait in our facilities, if the same quality care can be accomplished remotely. So it's an exciting time that we are seeing a positive movement and sustained use of virtual care going forward.
Claire, I would imagine you must be working with a number of different leaders from biotech and pharma and CROs. Are you sensing the same level of interest in committing to these new technologies, that the approaches that we've seen introduced as countermeasures to the pandemic, that people actually want to make them stick and make commitments?
Yes, I definitely am seeing that. I think, to Adam's point, the use of chatbots was really just an ingenious idea when it came to triaging patients in a way that allowed the providers to actually provide the best care and to the best use of their time, really, and PPE, of course. And then from the biotech perspective, I think the switch to virtual trials is something that was long coming. And I think it really allowed just better care and better ability to actually continue those clinical trials instead of having to halt them, wait for kind of a new system to be in place. I think switching to virtual was kind of the best case scenario. And I think a lot of CROs, but also sponsor companies, big pharma, they're realizing that this is probably the new normal, and probably they need to adapt, they need to make it work. And patients are really, they're responding. I think there's been very minimal issues from what I've heard. And if there are issues, there are opportunities to kind of pivot, to be agile, to be there for your patients, and of course, do that in a very secure, compliant, and safe way.
It's great to hear. I have a slide I had put up on Twitter, and maybe I'll reshare it with the MassBio hashtag, the 17-year history of decentralized clinical trials. And it was probably around 12 years ago that I was involved in designing and helping to lead the Pfizer remote trial in that area. So Claire, to your point, it's been a long time in coming, but maybe it took an event like this to really catalyze adoption with the critical urgency. Adam, I can't help but think to myself, though, we have on the healthcare side leaders that are implementing models for remote care to help patients and providers access one another. We have on the pharma and biotech side a whole separate ecosystem of solutions that people are looking to introduce to support virtual and remote participation in clinical trials. But at the end of the day, they're the same physicians and investigators. It's the same patients and research participants. Are we building an entirely redundant ecosystem? Is there a way we should be better leveraging the experience of one silo in the other area?
It's an important question you're raising, Craig. And first, I just want to say I think we're learning a lot about virtual care right now and delivering virtual care at scale. And as you might imagine, when we went from a small number of virtual visits per day to tens of thousands per day, and the rest of the world did that at the same time, and we also saw schools moving online, the whole world moving online. We learned a lot about what it takes to do virtual care at scale and have a resilient, high-quality platform that can be used for healthcare. And so we've learned a lot of the last 5 months. And so I think there would be huge value in in taking those lessons learned and working with pharma on an approach that's as efficient as possible. I have to say the other challenge we all have is there have been economic devastations to this time as well. And so if there are ways for us to have synergies, for us to have cost savings approaches from using the same infrastructure, using the same products, that would be hugely helpful. And then finally, we've also learned a lot about information security and virtual care, and how important it is to have a secure solution, particularly for healthcare encounters. And so those are also other lessons learned. And if we can be using the same infrastructure for both research and for clinical care, we can ensure that the very high information security precautions we're taking on our clinical products can also apply across research. So overall, I think there's a lot of benefit. There would be challenges, but I think it's worth advancing the discussion.
Claire, as you hear Adam's feedback and you think about how most sponsors and CROs, when they're running a multi-center trial, they want to have a sense of control and reduce the number of systems and tools that are being used. And so typically, we'll end up sourcing yet another remote care or video solution to introduce in their trial, typically then bringing it back to institutions like Adams, where leaders have been investing in systems that can fit inside their environment and work with known security and work within their workflow. Do you see a middle ground? Do you see a way that whether through quality standards or through better sharing of data, that we could start to enable institutions like Adams to be able to use their own HIT inside of these studies?
Well, I definitely see that happening. And I think one of the biggest problems is that standards are always going from sponsor companies or CROs to sites, to hospitals, and really kind of imposing their own standards, their own applications on those hospitals, on all sites kind of globally. And that's not always the best thing for both patient care, but also just for the hospital systems. I think there does need to be some more collaboration between large health systems, sponsor companies, CROs, kind of all the parties that are involved. And maybe that is just a community system where you're creating the standards, you're deciding preemptively, before you start the trials or before you go into a therapeutic area, kind of what are the standards that you're going to be focused on, what are the security measures that are going to be standard throughout, and throughout the life cycle of a trial, and then kind of working with the health systems. And if they've already invested millions of dollars in a certain system, maybe it makes sense to kind of accommodate them a little bit more and kind of on the back end do some additional work to ensure that the patients are getting the best care, but that the data is also still in kind of adhering to the integrity that you need.
So Adam, as we think about this, what could ideal collaboration potentially look like? On the one hand, it could mean there's simply a focus on standards and understanding quality standards and security and other attributes. Maybe there's an element of better understanding connections so that operational data that a CRO or a sponsor needs to monitor their study, perhaps they could extract that from some of the existing systems. But what else could this look like as we think about bringing different stakeholders together to try to take the best of what we have been all introducing in 2020 and embed it to make research run better and smarter going forward?
Yeah, so I think it would be interesting to understand a little bit about the requirements as Claire just outlined, and a little bit about what we've all learned. I mean, we've all sort of found interim solutions to move quickly to be able to respond to this new state. And so I think that's how I would start on this. Where I think there might be opportunities is particularly in some of the newer technologies that we are all implementing. So, I think about even just video conferencing technologies, remote patient monitoring technologies. These are areas that are still very early adoption in many organizations, and I think we have an opportunity to potentially influence. And so I think there would be an opportunity to come together to standardize some of these requirements and see if there's a way to bring the community together to develop shared requirements, and then to see if we can influence both product development in those areas from the vendors that are offering those products, as well as then adoption of those products by healthcare organizations.
I like it. And I like it because, I often will think to myself about how for those of us that run clinical trials, for years we've been trying to make a shift just to let patients bring their own devices into clinical trials and let them use their own mobile phones or other technology if they have and if that's their preference. And I feel like what we're talking about here almost is a bring your own HIT, and how we can let institutions that are investigator sites be able to leverage their investments. And my sense is that whether large academic medical centers all the way through to small investigator sites in the community, everyone has been looking to try and make the right investments and try to recover the cost of those investments. And so it feels like now more than ever is the right time for us to figure out how we can all make the best out of technology investments that are being made by peers in our environment, peers in our ecosystem.
Yeah, can I add, Craig, can I add one other caveat to this that's really important for us to all think about collectively, which is equity. And one thing that we are working very hard to do is, as we move more and more care virtually, including clinical trials, is to make sure that we are not excluding certain segments of the population because they may not have the technology needed. And so that would be a phenomenal area to work together on. How can we potentially provide technology, provide training to those who may not have access to these tools, to those tools, or know how to use them? And I think it could help them for the trial. It can also help them for their healthcare, and could actually help them in many other aspects of their life as well. So that would be another area where we could all partner together to really advance those patients' abilities to participate in trials and to participate in their healthcare going forward.
Adam, your comment is so important, and it reminds me of the importance of the words that we use, because for years in my organization, I used to talk to teams about enabling patients to bring their own device, because we had a model that was entirely based on provisioning hardware. It didn't matter if you had 3 iPhones in your pocketbook, we were giving you a 4th in order to support your participation in that trial. And so I really appreciate your calling out that last observation, because people would often look back at me and say, but are we going to leave people behind if we're expecting everybody to have a phone in their pocket or in their pocketbook? And I keep thinking that, I'm forgetting to sort of call that out explicitly. The pharma typical model has been one of provisioning for years. And so the idea here should never be to leave people behind if they don't have a technology, but it's also a great observation to say, how can these new approaches catalyze better and more diverse participation now more than ever, with 2 pandemics in this country, one of coronavirus and the second around racial justice and equality. Now more than ever, we need these types of countermeasures to try to help everybody be able to access research and participate if it's appropriate for them. Claire, do you have other observations around that?
Well, definitely, I 100% agree with what both of you said. And I think adding to that, this is definitely where I think technology can help, and technology companies can help. I think far too many times there's a divide between biotech, health systems, and technology companies. And I think this is a really great opportunity to have all 3 come together, really work together, whether that's creating standards, whether that's creating new programs to ensure that people from all walks of life, all backgrounds are getting the correct care, but then also all of the resources that they need to actually get that care.
Now, Claire, big changes can be hard for people. It's hard for us to lay out a big moonshot of a vision about a whole new way for us to shift clinical research and clinical trials and integrate research in healthcare. But in many ways, that's why I'm excited about this forum with NBC, because sometimes it's easier for us to compartmentalize things and be able to show in a contained environment that certain things are possible, that maybe it's hard to imagine when we think about the entire country or the entire globe. And to your point, Massachusetts is a very unique sandbox for us, with the conditions that are here of a rich and vibrant pharma and biotech and CRO community, along with such a rich academic and general healthcare community. Claire, how could you see ways that Massachusetts could be the great sandbox, the way that we could uniquely show what is possible by tapping into the MBC community?
Well, I think I have an outsider perspective. I'm non-Massachusetts. I'm actually located at Microsoft headquarters in Seattle. So as an outsider, we always view Massachusetts and Boston and Cambridge really as, you're right, that sandbox and that place of opportunity where there is everything within reach when it comes to biotech and health systems and academic medical centers. So I think a really good solution might be just some community-like grassroots efforts around creating standards or working together, or even just having an open dialogue. Whether that's kind of new virtual meetings and having an open dialogue with each group or each different industry and talking about kind of what we could be focusing on, what could be an opportunity where someone has a strength, but there's a weakness somewhere else and they can help with. So I definitely feel like there's opportunity, and I think the rest of the world is watching, and I think really Massachusetts is kind of poised to be one of the first to do something like this.
Now, Claire, I understand you don't live in Massachusetts right now. We won't hold that against you. I've left Massachusetts for a little while myself, but at least I'm still raising the kids as Red Sox and Bruins fans. So it's possible for us all. Adam, what about you as you think about this unique community that we have in Massachusetts? Are there ways that we could start to envision unprecedented collaborations, ways to use the Boston or Massachusetts community as a unique demonstration project to show what's possible?
Oh, I completely agree. And Claire really said it nicely. I also want to share that recently Jeff Leiden from Vertex Pharmaceuticals convened a state group with reps from all across the state, from both academia, the hospitals, as well as pharmaceutical industries around digital health. And really all around, how could Massachusetts, given the incredible expertise we have across all of those sectors, really accelerate digital health? And I think you're raising it specifically now for digital pharmaceutical trials. And I have no doubt that we really we can be and can be a leader in this area. I would say, as an immediate next step, and perhaps as a challenge, we should figure out, is there a pilot we can do? Can we bring together all these stakeholders and figure out something to do to try to see if we can advance this? So to move beyond the ideas and really try to find an application that we could all do together.
I think that it may be the best way for us to close out this conversation by sparking the next, and that next by aiming this as a challenge for all of us on this session, a challenge for all of us in the audience and in the community to start to think about ways that we can convene, use our respective organizations to come together across health systems, across pharma, CROs, patient groups in the community, and start to reimagine how clinical research can look differently, improving access and convenience, better integrating research within healthcare settings, and use the Massachusetts ecosystem to demonstrate what could be done radically different and lead in the country, perhaps in the world. Claire, Adam, I'd like to thank you for joining this conversation today, and I would like to turn things back over to Mike.
Thank you, Craig, Claire, and Adam, for your important observations.